Well, let's bring in our panel for this edition of Inside Story. Joining me from Lahore in Pakistan, we have Raza Karim, an international lawyer and activist. Gurpal Singh is a professor of Sikh and Punjab studies at the School of Oriental and African Studies and joins me via Skype from Leicester in England. And from New Delhi, Uday Bhaskar, director of the Society for Policy Studies, a retired commodore from the Indian Navy. Gentlemen, welcome to all of you. Mr. Kazim, can I begin with you in Pakistan, in Lahore? What a difference a day makes when it either be the 14th or the 15th of August. It has many mixed emotions for those people that either lived through the partition or continue to live with the effects of what is physically a line in the sand.
Well, yes, of course, this has been a lifetime. I've spent 70 years now in Pakistan, and it was a time of illusion and disillusionment and rethinking. That is how I would sum it up. Now, after disillusionment, as I said earlier, that we had a great deal of illusions that Pakistan would be a brand new place, completely and qualitatively different from the experience of colonial India. But it was not to be so. As I said earlier, that what we confronted was a huge vacuum, a human vacuum, an economic vacuum, and
A social vacuum as well.
Vacuum of governance as well. Yes, and that we had to grapple and muddle through somehow in the early days. But thereafter, once things began to settle down, it appeared that there was no new beginning at all.
Sure.
And it was going to be something worse than what British India was.
Mr. Bhaskar, let me come to you in New Delhi. I mean, how do you, and perhaps you can't speak for all of India, but certainly a good section of it, how do you perceive the whole issue of independence and partition and the wounds that have been left emotionally over the last 7 decades?
70 years later, when I look back at partition on August 15th, 1947, I would say that on balance, the mood is positive, optimistic, and a certain degree of satisfaction that India has been able to evolve in the way that it has. But yes, there is a huge human dimension. I was born after partition, after 1947, but I have had occasion to speak to a number of people who experienced it firsthand. And while the political sort of context of partition and freedom is something which was very, very celebratory, both for India and I dare say for Pakistan, there was a huge human cost. And I think when we look at the numbers now and the kind of dislocation that took place, it was traumatic. It was a bloodbath for certain periods when the religious dimension came to the fore. And I would say that for those who experienced it, my personal conversations with them would suggest that there are some scars that will never heal. But as we go down generation to generation, I would say that perhaps some of these memories are now getting a bit dulled with time. But families still recall how they came to India and the cross of being a refugee.
Okay.
And this is something which I believe is a human experience that has no parallel as far as Asia is concerned.
No, let's go to Gurpal Singh. And of course, the story, certainly those two experiences there from Lahore and New Delhi are perhaps something that's been reflected and you've heard many times yourself, Mr. Singh, in the course of your own career. But again, you know, the issues of divisiveness socially, economically, religiously and regionally has been something that's been ongoing for the past 7 decades, and then independently within Pakistan and within India. I mean, what do you think the largest challenges have been for the administrations that came after 1947, if it's possible to sum it up?
Well, the challenges were different in the two states. Of course, Pakistan did not exist and it had to be created out of virtually nothing, and the administrative structure there was very weak. And India was the succeeding, sorry, Pakistan was the succeeding state from India. And India had much more resources and much more experience in dealing with the situation. So in that sense, the relative experience of the immediate impact of partition is very, very different. Having said that, the events, as the previous speakers highlighted, were catastrophic, probably the most seminal point in South Asian history in the 20th century. And in that sense, they have shaped both the history of Pakistan and India itself, and are very much embedded in the national discourse of each of these countries.
Mr. Kazim, let me bring you in here in Lahore. I mean, what is the national discourse at the moment when it comes to partition? Because as soon as you mention the word, the debate then begins about dialogue with India and trying to find a peaceful way forward, if there is one, to try and resolve many issues. I don't want to get embroiled in the Kashmir issue. That's a different subject for a different day, but it's a highly important issue. It is a highly important issue. I know you're giggling, but it's a highly important issue, we know, and it's fundamental to the way these two countries react with one another.
Yes. Now, look, India and Pakistan are part of the overall global situation, and they have an impact upon Indian policies and Pakistani policies. And I'm sure that countries other than India and Pakistan have interests in where India goes and how it goes, and the same about Pakistan. So we're not only suffering from the problems of partition and Kashmir issues, we're also involved with the geopolitics, global geopolitics. And large countries have, such as the United States, have an interest in India. Vis-a-vis China maybe, I don't know. But certainly in Pakistan, vis-a-vis the Soviet Union as it was until 1990. Pakistan was a vital base for the United States in its problems with the Soviet Union, the late Soviet Union. So we've been, you can't really look at India and Pakistan policies in the isolation of the subcontinent. You have to see it in a larger picture.
Okay.
That is how I would answer your question.
Mr. Singh, can I bring you in here in Leicester on a point that Mr. Kazim has just raised about how intrinsically connected Pakistan and India have been in global effects, global incidents, whether it be the Cold War of the 1950s onwards, to the way the dynamics that each country has had with the superpowers, whether it be China, the United States or Russia. How influenced has their domestic policy been in relationship to their connection with those global heavyweights?
I think the global context needs to be put in perspective. Of course, India and Pakistan are part of a globalized world today, very different from the one in 1947. But this global context is very much shaped by the enduring rivalry between the two states and the two peoples and the two governing elites of these two states, which arises out of the partition. For example, Pakistan's search for security after 1947 led it to become part of the American-backed alliance system against Cold War. Similarly, India's outreach to the broader world in the non-alignment movement was part of its efforts to build an alternative bloc. But if you look at the rhetoric and the rivalry of the political elites in the two countries, it's very much coded in the pre-partition period between the Muslim League and the Congress, and nowadays between the Muslim League and the BJP. I cannot see how we can escape the dead hand of history in the relationship between these two states.
And then, therefore, I'll come back to Mr. Bhaskar in New Delhi. What is then, you might say, the relationship as you see it between India and its former colonial power, the United Kingdom, and sometimes the relationship that the UK has with Pakistan? You know, is it a good one? Is it a bad one? Is it an indifferent one? How would you describe it in 2017?
I would describe the relationship between India and Britain 70 years later as being a very affable one, meaning that there is a certain comfort level between New Delhi and London. And this is something that is reflected in the kind of political and the societal relationship between the two countries, even after Brexit and the various convulsions that have gone on in Britain and Europe over the last few years. So to that extent, I think for London and Delhi, there is a certain inbuilt comfort level. But I do want to get back to the point that both my other panelists had touched upon already, which is the nature of the discourse in India, as also about the other. I briefly want to bring in this whole question of the genesis of August 1947, which was the Pakistani commitment to what they call the two-nation theory, and the sense that you could build a state based on religion alone. And at the time, Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, who later becomes India's first Prime Minister, and the founding fathers, who believed in a certain underlying principle of what you might call as secularism, where religion was not the predominant determinant for statehood and national identity. I think if you look at this from that perspective, for India, I think the discourse here would suggest that Pakistan has not been able to come to terms with its own internal dynamic and the role of the military. 50 out of 70 years, the military has been in the driver's seat in Pakistan, has led to what one of my panelists had called the enduring rivalry between the two.
Well, then let's ask the Pakistani panelist, Mr. Raza Kazim, about the issue of Jinnah's very untimely death within a year of partition. No other statesman really of his stature to take over. Yes, there was a prime minister and prime ministers after that took over, but it really was, as Mr. Singh also said, the institutions were not in Pakistan. There was no, in theory, rule of law or redress and a constitution, more importantly, that the Pakistanis could go to appeal. I mean, how important were those early years in the way that Pakistan has addressed the issues of social and legal responsibility in the country?
Well, I would say, to put it politely, that we've been muddling through since Jinnah. I happened to be at his funeral as well, so I recall vividly the context of your question. And we've been muddling through. I personally, you see, I must share with you the fact that I have been a dissident in this country for 70 years. I've been to prison 5 times without having been ever convicted, and just for disagreeing. Now, I personally am of the view that we need to go back to the beginning and start discovering a new civilization, a whole holistic structure for the society. I think that bits and parts of society are not going to be easily repairable or manageable. We'll have to take a holistic view.
If that is possible, I think you're and Mr. Bhaskar certainly. So Mr. Bhaskar's agreeing. I just want to bring Mr. Singh in here because I think he agrees with you as well. That bringing in that holistic approach to try and sort the problems out is one thing, Mr. Singh. But what we have found, and we've seen it on the flags of both India and Pakistan, there is a big white stripe on both flags, which was supposed to represent the minorities of the countries when they became independent, regardless of whether they were Hindus or Muslims. And it is them, whether it's Christians, Sikhs, Jews, they were all supposed to be protected. But in the partition, not everybody got a fair say, did they? In self-determination to a certain extent, it was very much either you're Muslim or you're Hindu, and this is where the line's going to be.
Yes, when the 3rd of June plan was drawn up, the transfer of power, as was agreed, was to two dominions of Pakistan and India. So in a sense, the minor nationalities or minor groupings or anybody who disagreed with that settlement were marginalized. It was a transfer of power to simply the Muslim League and the Indian National Congress that represented Muslim Pakistan and majority Hindu Congress. And in a way, the threat to minorities that existed at partition some would argue has been borne out by the events after the 70 years. Of course, India is a secular state, and that has always been its strength and rhetoric vis-a-vis Pakistan. But if Jinnah and Nehru were alive today, I wonder what they would think of India's democracy today and what is happening under the BJP to religious minorities.
Okay, well, Mr. Bhaskar, let me just bring you in here. And we're coming nearly to the end of the programme, so we'll speed it along. Just wondering about tolerance within India at the moment. In the last, certainly, few years, we've seen perhaps intolerance of minority faiths, especially in the UP province when it comes to the eating of beef or the transport of cattle. We've seen a quite distinct divide between Hindus and Muslims. If we look at Pakistan, we look at the Sunni, the Shia issues, and we've seen Sunni shrines being attacked in a different side of intolerance. What's your impression of the way India has moved towards that intolerance? And is it partly to blame about what happened in 1947?
Well, I would say that what is happening in India now, you drew attention to the fact that there is a growing level of intolerance. And yes, in the last 3 years, we have had certain incidents which relate to for instance, to issues like the ban on beef. Now, that in turn has been related to the minorities, quote unquote, both the religious minority, in this case the Muslims, as also the social minorities, that is the equivalent of the Dalits or those who were once upon a time called untouchable. So I think if you look at this in a larger context, as an Indian, many of us are uneasy, and this has been expressed in different ways, but there is a certain, I would say, level of confidence about the Indian commitment to the Constitution. Now, India gave unto itself a constitution in January of 1950, and that is where I think the whole concept of citizenship that goes beyond any kind of sectarian identity was enshrined. We had Dr. Ambedkar, who had brought in a number of clauses. So I think I would say this at an individual level, that yes, there is a sense of unease and disquiet about what has happened in, say, recent months. But at the same time, there is a degree of confidence reposed in the Constitution and the way in which it is respected by every organ of the state. And I think that perhaps would be the resilience of India, as it was established many years ago when we had an emergency for a brief 18 months under then Prime Minister Indira Gandhi. So I would say that is really the saving grace for India. And I do not want to say anything about Pakistan when we have such an eminent lawyer with us on the panel.
Indeed, I'm sure Mr. Kazim appreciates that. Unfortunately, we have actually run out of time. It's one of those subjects that we will come back to again, hopefully not in another 70 years, but sooner rather than later. But gentlemen, there, unfortunately, I do have to leave it there. And I think we could have talked about it a lot longer as well. For Raza Karim in Lahore, thank you for your time, sir. Also, Gurhapal Singh in Leicester and Uday Bhaskar in New Delhi. Gentlemen, thank you very much. And thank you for watching. Of course, you can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website at aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle there is at AJ Inside Story. From me, Sahil Rahman, and the rest of the Inside Story team, thanks very much for your time and your company.